this is, I think, a pretty interesting and pretty important panel on water and water resiliency. We have had a few casualties this morning and a few substitutions, so unfortunately, Bob Hertzberg had to be in Sacramento. We know they have work to do, so we will excuse him. And Mayor Garcia came down with this flu, so we wish him a very, very speedy recovery. But we have Jeff Bleich, our former ambassador to Australia, an attorney, an expert in many areas, but is going to be able to give us a global perspective today. Mark Pastorella, who is the head of the County Department of Public Works, a 29-year veteran of the Department of Public Works and the county, engineer by training, who's also going to set the table for us in terms of the topic of water and water resiliency. And then Katie Young. Katie is representing Supervisor Sheila Kuehl, LA County Supervisor, and I love her portfolio: water, environment, and the arts. So we're going to have a charrette on water tomorrow, and I'm sure your art background is going to help us with that. Well, when I thought about the topic and introducing it, I thought about this word of resiliency. And what does resiliency, in fact, mean? What does it conjure up? It conjures up the capacity to recover quickly from difficulty, toughness, elasticity, and the ability of a substance or an object to spring back into shape. Well, when we think about our water and the droughts that we've had in California, and with climate change, these extremes in temperatures and climate, from floods and fires and mudslides and death and destruction, we have a huge challenge in front of us. So I think that the ideas generated by this panel and the solutions that we're going to hear about are going to be pretty important. But first, we have a very special guest by video in the spirit of technology and social media to welcome us this morning. And she just disappeared. And did I step on a plug?
I think she's going to do it after Mark and before me.
After Mark, but before me. Before you.
Yeah.
You think so?
I think she's introducing me.
She's introducing Katie. Okay.
All right.
So we're going to hear first from Mark, who is going to set the table, going back to the setup, for what's happening in LA County around the topic of water, and resiliency. So Mark, let me turn it over to you.
Very good. Thank you, Kathleen. And you're right, there is so much going on in this area, and there always has been. Of about 30 years, I've been working in the area of water for Los Angeles County Department of Public Works, and my current title is Director of Public Works. And as such, I'm overseeing 6 business areas for the County of Los Angeles regionally. These 6 areas are water, waste, transportation, public buildings, construction, emergency management, and a review of development in LA County unincorporated areas. All interesting infrastructure subjects that all intertwine with each other, and it's sort of the topic of discussion for today is how do we integrate our infrastructure to best serve and manage the natural resources of Los Angeles County. The County of Los Angeles, for those of you that aren't from Los Angeles County, is about the size of Delaware and Rhode Island put together. 10 million people reside within the County of Los Angeles. And since I need to really move along because we have 7 minutes, I'll get quickly to the water resources list, drop for you a little bit about the water resources of Los Angeles County. The county's residents use, the demand is about 1.6 million acre feet a year, if you will. I like to say about 1/3 of the drinking water supply from LA County comes from imported sources that could be larger in certain times of the year. Another 1/3 comes from our water, our stormwater, our rainwater local supply. Another 1/3 from reclaim. Those are rough numbers, and the water wonks in here will probably argue with me that those percentages are different. Just depends on where you're sitting. But remember, I'm talking about the larger picture of Los Angeles County. Numbers are different based on watershed. There are 8 major watersheds in Los Angeles County. The climate in each of those watersheds can be actually quite different, from the arid northern Antelope Valley area all the way out to Catalina Island. The precipitation in Los Angeles County is about 11 inches in downtown Los Angeles in any given year, an average year. and the precipitation at the top of the mountains in Los Angeles County can be up to 30-something plus 40 inches of rain per year. So it gives you a sense of what we get in terms of local water. Again, trying to create a more water resilient LA is a challenge because of what you just heard from me. The things that are challenging that, I always say, number one is governance. The governance of water in Los Angeles County is governed by over 200 water retailers in the greater Los Angeles basin, each of them with their own boards, if you will, with their own agenda. And so you can imagine for all of us as we head off to Washington, D.C., and we have 200 different ideas about what the priorities should be, or we're all buying water from different entities, or our residents are living in different areas that we serve. And so having 200 water retailers or more is a huge challenge. And so I put that under governance. One of the things we've been doing locally to manage that governance is to work together to prioritize the water resources needed in Los Angeles County through efforts like our Integrated Regional Water Management Group, driven by Prop 50, the early Proposition 1584, the state water bonds that were passed and really push for integration of our looking at water. And those have been very effective in getting us to think and prioritize, like I said, the water needs of Los Angeles County. The Department of Public Works chairs that group. The other thing that's happening you've been aware of is that climate change is absolutely affecting the weather patterns here in Los Angeles County. Now, I've been here 30 years, and that's not all of time of LA County, but we've been keeping records for over 100 years on rainfall in Los Angeles County and weather. And even that record isn't long enough, but at least tells us something about what's happening. And what I'd say, because I have a short amount of time again, is that we actually, through our studies, working with Bureau of Reclamation and peer-reviewed by many of the agencies in the room, including UCLA and others, have come up with sort of this picture of what we expect to happen going forward. We expect that the area will get drier and warmer. And with drier and warmer temperatures, we get hyper evaporation of our water supply through storage. But also we're getting this phenomenon that has always happened, but it's increasing with more regular frequency, and that is that we're having wildfires. We're having increased wildfire conditions in which sedimentation becomes a major issue, because after a wildfire you see debris flows. And those debris flows end up really threatening the open storage of LA County, the major reservoirs here in LA County. Right now I have about 29 million cubic yards of sediment to remove from the 14 major reservoirs in Los Angeles County. All that sediment is taking up reservoir space. So that's one of the conditions and one of the things that we see happening. There's many other effects of climate change, and the other, well, I should mention one other, is that we're expecting the same amount of water, but in a shorter period of time. So more violent storms, if you will, more heavy rainfall, more intense rainfall, with fewer storms happening through the years. And you actually see that happening this year with the storm. We've only had one major storm so far this year, and it was quite a violent storm. It did not end up hitting LA County in a way that it hit Montecito, but that is an example of what we're seeing in terms of climate change. So one of the things that we've been doing in terms of these prioritization of the water resources is looking where we should invest our money. And it's really all the above: stormwater, recycled water, imported water. Our position is that all of them matter. Water conservation by locals, even desal, being looked at desal as a potential for water supply. One area of great interest to our County Board of Supervisors is making an investment in our local water supply, and specifically stormwater capture. And so I'm going to leave it right there for Katie to talk about stormwater capture and the opportunities here in Los Angeles County to capture more and address and create a more water resilient Los Angeles County.
Great. Well, Katie is going to have a very special person introduce her.
Hi, I'm really sorry I can't be there today to talk about one of my very favorite topics, water. At last year's Verde Exchange panel on stormwater, I announced that the county would be developing a stormwater funding measure to develop green infrastructure projects that clean stormwater and provide for its reuse while also providing playing fields and green space. So we've been working really hard this past year with a lot of stakeholders to make sure that the funding measure is ready for the November ballot. We've still got a lot of work ahead, and your input is critical to its success. Stormwater capture and reuse is so important, and I'm confident that we can create a program that makes our region more water resilient. Katie will get into the details, so over to you, Katie.
Here you go, Katie.
Yeah, yeah. Apologies that the supervisor couldn't be here today. She's the chair of the board and is busy prepping for that tomorrow. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about why stormwater is so important to our region, and then get into a little bit of the funding measure itself and where we are in the development process, and then sort of talk briefly about the value proposition of why we think it makes sense for the county to be taking the leadership role on a funding measure. So stormwater, why is it important? Mark got into it a little bit. A lot of our water comes from other places. We import it. That's becoming increasingly fraught with climate change. It's increasingly unreliable as weather changes. And so, as Mark said, we're becoming increasingly reliant on local water. And we see stormwater as a critical piece of that, a really great opportunity to be capturing the water that right now flows very effectively, for the most part, straight out into the ocean and our rivers, where it picks up pollutants along the way. So this is a problem. It's a public health problem, but it also presents an amazing opportunity. The county's already doing a lot of stormwater capture and recharge. We have spreading basins throughout our region that captures water from our dams and infiltrates it into the groundwater basins, which is great, but we could be doing more of it, and we could be doing more of it in a more diffuse fashion through neighborhood level projects and regional projects. And so what do these projects look like? They vary. They can be parks, playing fields that also include infiltration basins underneath for capturing, treating, and saving the water for future use. It can be green streets, bioswales, shade trees, where water is diverted from dry weather runoff, and also stormwater is diverted from the streets and is treated and used, saved for future use to water those same plants. We see these projects happening on schools. There's a Bassett High School in Supervisor Solis's district that's being built that has playing fields with educational gardens and groundwater infiltration underneath. And so these are the sorts of projects that we see having great benefit, not just for the stormwater quality benefit, but for the supply and other benefits like community benefits, climate change adaptation and mitigation, and the like. So what we know is that if we build these projects strategically in the right places based on where there's great infiltration and other opportunities, we could be capturing enough water during a wet year to provide water for 2.5 million people for a year. So last year it was really wet. We lost enough water for 2.5 million people that we could have captured if we build these sorts of projects. The problem is that we don't have an ongoing funding stream to be paying for these projects, and we've been increasingly spending our own sort of general reserve funds to be paying for them. Cities also want to be building them for the benefits that I talked about. They're also required to be building these projects under the Federal Clean Water Act. There's a mandate that municipalities build multi-benefit stormwater capture projects as part of their compliance with the Federal Clean Water Act. So not only are we all required to do it, we want to do it because we think there's inherent value in these types of projects. And there's a really nice symmetry between what our permit requires and what we want to be doing. So what are we doing? What is the Safe Clean Water Program, which is what we're calling our funding measure that's being developed? It's a parcel tax that we're developing that will pay for these multi-benefit projects, ongoing operations and management, that'll increase local water supply, clean up our stormwater, provide those additional benefits I talked about, like greening communities. There's state legislation that was passed this past year that already sort of predetermines the buckets where the money's going to go. So 40% is going to go back to cities and unincorporated LA County for local projects. 50% will be focused on regional projects. And that's where we see more of a water supply benefit emphasis, and then 10% for administration, oversight, governance. So where are we in the process? We've started a robust stakeholder engagement process. We have a stakeholder advisory committee, which is made up of representatives from all of our 88 cities in the county of Los Angeles, labor, business, big landowners, engineers, water and parks agencies. We really want this to be a sort of a holistic effort at looking at water in a new way, which we're excited about. And so we've been meeting monthly. We've had 4 or 5 meetings so far. We're going to be starting to convene subcommittees pretty soon to get into the details of criteria development, governance, equity, crediting. Crediting is really important. We want to make sure that people who are already doing things on their property are getting credit for that, so they're not charged the full amount of the parcel tax or get a rebate.
Could you give more examples of crediting?
Yeah, sure. So Universal Studios, for example, is the largest landowner, I believe, in our district. And they actually are doing an incredible amount of stormwater capture already on site. They have effectively 0 untreated runoff. And they do that because they have to, but they're also amazing environmental stewards, and they want to be doing it. They have their own permit that dictates how they manage stormwater and dry weather runoff on their property. So that's one example. They shouldn't have to pay the full parcel tax, so we're working closely with the Universal Stormwater team to figure out, and others to figure out how best to make sure that they're not effectively paying twice. But they still recognize that the supply and other benefits of the funding measure might mean that they'll end up paying something. So we're doing additional meetings with stakeholders beyond just the Stakeholder Advisory Committee meeting. Mark and I are running all over the county, meeting with folks. It's been fun. Doing a lot of public education and outreach to help voters understand what stormwater is, because it's not obvious necessarily. And so in terms of timeline, we're hoping to put this before the Board of Supervisors in July, August at the absolute latest, to go on the November 18 ballot. And then just briefly, why do we think the county's a good, leader on this, and why should we be taking the reins on trying to put something on a sort of a county-wide basis? And so part of it has to do with the fact that water knows no political boundaries. When it rains, water doesn't care if it's in Pasadena or South Pasadena, Beverly Hills or City of LA. It flows wherever the roads take it. So we think it makes sense to be looking at it from a regional approach. The State Water Board agreed, which is why our permit is regional in nature. We also know that there are 8 major watersheds in LA County, 88 cities. Everyone wants money to be doing these projects. Nobody wants to have 88 funding measures on various ballots. The logistics of that would be challenging. It's hard enough to do one big one, let alone 88. A couple of cities have already done their own. Most of those are supportive of what we're doing, and there's a lot of money needed to do this, so most of them are happy to be supportive of this effort as well. When we also actually already play a pretty important regional role as managers of the flood control district, which runs throughout much of Los Angeles County and is sort of the backbone infrastructure for mitigating flood risk. So I think that's about it. It's exciting. It's sort of what we're focused on right now in Supervisor Kuehl's office around sustainability, and I think it's an exciting new way of thinking about water regionally. Thanks.
Great, Katie, thank you. Let's try and get a little global perspective now from Jeff.
Well, thank you, Kathleen. I think I'm called in for 2 reasons. One, to give a global perspective, because as you said, I was U.S. Ambassador in Australia, where they are extraordinarily water stressed, and we work closely together on climate change issues, and particularly building resilience for their economy and for ours. The other reason I think I was asked to do this is I'm now running for political office. I'm running for lieutenant governor, and so I think people just assume I'm getting used to navigating murky water. So, one, I start with the first. Without repeating what's already been said too much, the issues that were described in LA County apply statewide, and they actually apply throughout the West. If you just look at California, we've got 2 principal sources for importing water to this region. One is snow cap, which is diminishing, and the other is the Colorado River, which is also diminishing, not only because of climate change effects, but also because we've been overdrawing on it dramatically, and so are other states. And many years, the Colorado River doesn't even reach the sea anymore. So if this is what we're relying upon for our water future, It's not a promising tale, and so we're going to have to find other ways of producing water that is potable and fresh water. Obviously, we need to look at stormwater and rainwater and other sources, groundwater, and but it's not just that story, because that story has been known for a long time. The bigger story is the impact of climate change and how it is radically accelerating some of these challenges, including reducing precipitation and the higher rate of evaporation and the heating of our cities and the intensity of the rain, which now runs off much more quickly because you have fewer storms and they're much more powerful, and they run off of dry surfaces and go out to the sea. So you add all that together, and I think, as Andy Lipka said earlier today, we are in a situation where our governance structure and our infrastructure was not designed for the climate that we have now. And so the challenges that we've known about for a while and that we've sort of slow-rolled, we don't have that luxury anymore, and we really are in a much more urgent situation with respect to water resilience. So the good news is that other countries have confronted this, and they have made extraordinary progress, and in ways that Americans, I think, often feel we're not capable of doing. So I will give a couple minutes on what Australia's situation was. Australians, first let me put it in perspective. Australians, very similar to the U.S. In terms of water use, they were right up there. I think we were the top 2 countries in the world in terms of per capita water use. And also they, a little bit like Americans, whenever the government says something's urgent, they believe, well, government, they can't do anything right. We're not going to do anything about it. And so they were 4 years into a drought that extended from 1997 to 2009, one of the worst, by far the worst drought in their history. They were about 4 years in before they appreciated that they needed to make some massive, massive changes. They actually got down to 27% of their total water supply by the end of that drought. So a crisis was a terrible thing to waste, and Australians responded. And I like to think the same thing about us. In fact, recently we had the Australian ambassador to the U.S. here, and he was visiting California. He said, mate, Australians, we're just like Californians, except we love America. Yeah. So here are a few things that they did. One thing they did was they dramatically increased the capture of rainwater, and so that it didn't become stormwater. They had catchments throughout the urban areas. In fact, in Melbourne now, 1 out of 3 families has a cistern, which captures water from rain and also off of rooftops coming into their cisterns. That has had a dramatic effect. They have adopted a number of other technologies that reduce the amount of runoff of their water and actually allowed it to go back into the water table. Permeable walkways as opposed to concrete, things like that. And as a result, their water use dropped from 80 gallons per person to 40, kind of in half.
Say it again.
From 80 gallons to 40 gallons, by 50% reduction. They have dramatically changed their use of stormwater. So they recaptured much more stormwater, didn't allow it to flow out to the sea. They have different standards than we have in terms of reuse of gray water, and that was extraordinarily effective for them as well. And it may be something that we look at in terms of where can we use this treated water and how can we get some variances from EPA regulations for areas that aren't going to affect human health in any way. When you're talking about reclaiming stormwater. The other thing is we've already had some innovations from state leaders. Bob Hertzberg would have been here, but I have to give him great credit for Senate Bill 231, which was just signed into law by Governor Brown at the end of last year, which will give local communities the ability to do innovative things and multi-use and take advantage of multiple uses of stormwater by virtue of the fact that they don't have to go to the voters to apply for fees to pay for this. They'll be able to do it directly based upon the interpretation in SB 231. So by changing the governance structure, by identifying these ways in which you can recapture water and conserve, and I didn't even go into desal and a number of other things that they did in Australia, they were able to navigate through that drought crisis. And the last thing I'll say is 8 years of that behavior didn't end when the drought ended. The great thing about Australia is that per capita number that I gave you of 40 is still the same number now, 9 years later after the drought. And so I think there is hope. And I look forward to seeing California adopt some of the things that I learned from the Australians during my time down under.
Great, thank you, Jeff. You know, when I look at Australia and Israel, and two countries that experience droughts of extreme proportions, and California has certainly seen its share of droughts, and it looks like this year they're predicting could be another drought year. One of the things that struck me is as soon as that crisis was faced and embraced, those countries federalized water. Water had always been local, but in terms of government action, the first thing they did was take charge at the federal, the top level. Now, forget the feds for a minute. Let's just talk California. And you said, Mark, when you opened, that you had in California how many water agencies? 200 water agencies. I think that there are more like 6,000 water agencies if you look at the state. And it's not just stormwater agencies, it's wastewater, clean water, stormwater, irrigation districts, reclamation, and on and on and on. And if you look at the map, you can punch in Google water agencies California, and a map with dots that looks like a polka dot dress pops up, and you go, this is crazy. So governance, that was the first thing that you picked on. Could you elaborate on that for us?
So a little more clarity too. When I said 200, I was talking about water retailers in the greater Los Angeles basin, and you're right, Kathleen, there are so many more interested parties. I mean, there's over 500 that could say they have something to do with the water that ends up out of the tap in any home in the greater Los Angeles area, including the Antelope Valley. So it is tremendous. It's a tremendous, all well-intended, all created for the purpose of delivering clean, safe water to people in their homes. As far as stormwater agencies go, it's interesting in that they're pretty much the LA County Flood Control District, which is the largest stormwater agency and water conservation agency for this area, and we are blessed that have had the foresight to create such a district and to be under state statute that is in pretty much the backbone system for stormwater capture in this area. So this has created a great opportunity for us to partner as a stormwater, and that's my department, to partner with those water retailers in looking how we better can invest in a system, improve that existing system while expand upon it. So one of the things that's come about in terms of governance that I think has been very effective is, and it always is incentivizing agencies with money to do something commonly, and that's what Prop 1584 did. It did a nice job in drawing up, not ideal, but an interesting governance structure that we have been practicing now for some time, and has resulted in a lot of first prioritization of projects for the region. By asking for projects, we had to decide which projects were to go. We split that governance into 5 major watersheds, and then we used regional leadership as well as local representation from those watersheds to identify, again, the priorities of the area in terms of its need for water, different water uses, and then also the investments that would be made ultimately in those areas. We also included components of park as well as disadvantaged communities in that governance. And it was, and it continues to be, the first time in the greater Los Angeles area where we had a lot of communication amongst large watershed representatives across the communities, and a lot of learning that went on about what actually goes on, say, in the east area of Los Angeles County versus the west, or north or south. The city of LA is large enough area to have almost the entire LA River watershed under its own governance, and they played ball in that governance as well. And we have multiple partner projects that have been going forward that have been very beneficial to the water resiliency of Los Angeles County. For example, one result of that governance has been that we prioritize, at least for the LA River watershed area, the San Fernando groundwater cleanup. The basins being used as storage, cleaning up the legacy pollutants there. So you had a regional entity saying the priority should be the basin cleanup. That would have never been done if you just went and asked that, East San Gabriel area, is that the priority for this regional water management group or the area? So again, I think there is hope that governance can be done, and we are modeling the Safe Clean Water program after that governance, a watershed-based governance for the management of this very important water natural resource in Los Angeles County.
Now, this conference is a convening of people from the public sector, the policymakers, the private sector. So my next question is really for the three of you. And obviously if you're doing an infrastructure project and the government is doing it soup to nuts, they're engaging the private sector through contracting. But I want to take that to another level. Given what some would think would regard as an exigent circumstance, meaning the speed with which our climate conditions are changing, the way our storm system and weather conditions are behaving, is there a role, and if so, what kind of a role for the private sector do you see? And it's a political question, it's a financial question, it's a policy question. And maybe I'll start with you, Katie, from the political perspective.
Sure. So it's obviously very important to bring in all voices to the conversation. Our business communities are very interested in and a little bit nervous about what we might be doing in November. And so bringing them on board, developing a crediting program that works for them, and making sure that we're being really efficient with our use of public funds is something that's really, really important to them. So one of the things that we're doing is making sure that as we craft the criteria for which projects are eligible and what threshold requirements there are, making sure that projects are leveraging other pots of money is really important, both to us because we want to be efficient with our use of the funds, and also to the business community, which has expressed a real interest in making sure that we're leveraging those pots. So there's state money, there's local money, maybe someday there'll be federal money. And then also, in terms of technologies, we sent a delegation to Israel a couple of years ago to go to their big water conference, and brought back some great ideas that we could be using here. And there were lots of government delegations from around the world that were there, and I think everybody has the same thing in mind, which is see what's out there, take best practices, put them to use here as quickly as possible.
Mark?
Yeah, I think interesting that P3 has been a difficult scenario to come up with for water. It hasn't been one that you see a lot of success in, other than what I can think of in terms of groundwater banking, and there is a groundwater bank in North County here that is privately owned, and is water trading occurring there post adjudication of that area. But also, with that said, the regulatory relief or the way in which business might take advantage of what we're doing is having regional treatment occur where industrial permits, Clean Water Act compliant permits for industry could get relief by actually investing in a regional solution rather than individual property solutions, one in which I think that industry is already interested in, and this is sort of back to the crediting. My first thought on crediting is anybody with an industrial permit, MS4 permit, ought to be looking at trying to get credit for that, what they've done under that permit. It allows us to audit it pretty easily too, because we know they have to comply with something. But I've had situations in which neighborhood businesses have looked at what we're building in that neighborhood and said, can I get permit or get regulatory relief by actually investing in your regional facility? So if you look at what's happening with the schools, we would look at the schools and say, you have open property, we'd like to actually run water to you and actually pay you to take that water and clean that water. So that is servicing more than just their individual lot, but actually giving a greater benefit to the community, including business. So I think there could be some cost savings for business to operate in LA County. where we're creating a system of governance like this that allows us to think about it from a regional and a neighborhood, regional, and larger scales.
Isn't the county doing one small P3 project now, and not stormwater, but in another?
Yeah, I imagine there is a number of P3 startups going on in the county in different sectors. We are in the transportation side, for instance, looking at some P3 scenarios within our road right-of-ways and that. But there has been a couple on the public building side of the house. The Long
social
Beach
infrastructure.
Yeah, the Long Beach vertical infrastructure where we've had buildings built. That's been ongoing for some time, and they're owned by private developers, and actually it's like a lease scenario, leaseback scenario from the developer. Those are the most likely P3s that we see happening in LA County. Interesting with the federal government infrastructure bill that they're coming out and pushing that idea. What I would just say on that is that the counties and the cities here are the best partner with the federal government because we self-taxed ourselves, and we're ready to build things. We don't have a problem putting our 2 cents in. We just like to see the money come directly to LA County rather than go through the bureaucracies of Washington, D.C.
Jeff, how about internationally?
Yeah, no, I think, again, this goes back to our governance structure. We need to create more incentives because it's all hands on deck time, and we should have many more public-private partnerships in California working on this issue and engaging in creativity, innovation, and frankly, financial resources of the private sector. When I was in Australia, you saw quite a bit of that. One of the great success stories during that drought is, for example, in Melbourne, there was a tremendous increase in canopies that were built. Those were mostly from the commercial sector, businesses that operated in these extremely dense, mostly concrete regions. Increased the canopy. I think at that point it was about 20% to 40%.
And when you say canopy, just for
that's just putting trees in.
Trees.
Yeah, trees.
Yeah. We're not talking about a sail, canvas, kind of.
Yes. So planting trees is one of the best things you can do in terms of conserving water, both because it captures water, but also it reduces evaporation by reducing the heat because of the canopy. So sorry to shorthand that one.
That's okay. That's okay.
But they were. That was just one of many initiatives that reflected what the private sector does. Up in Northern California, Bosco, when they had a regional agreement to try to address the fact that there was in the event of an earthquake, the Bay Area would be completely water starved because of their dependence on water coming from the San Joaquin or through the San Joaquin Valley. They brought in a number of private sector partners, not only ones who are in water-intensive industries, but also ones who just were concerned about the long-term viability of their business if they were going to be in a community that was that vulnerable to water loss, that they'd lose their employees, they'd go out of business. So this is a big untapped resource, and we can look to, I think in particular, Israel and Australia for examples of the business community being champions and real leaders in this effort.
Great. I'd love to have a few minutes for questions from the audience. I have some more for the panel, but let me just ask if there are questions for anyone in the audience. Yes, Mike George, our master, water master.
So as we talk about pulling together the money that's going to require for all of this infrastructure development and recognize the importance of bringing in private finance, one of the big differences between here and other countries is our system of tax-exempt financing for municipalities and the federal rules that make it very difficult to marry municipal finance, tax-exempt finance, with private sector finance. Any ideas about how to address that elephant in the room?
I think there's others in the room that are better suited to answer that question, but I'll say this, I agree with you.
Come to the next panel.
Yeah.
How about that, Mike? Stay tuned. We've got finance and innovation in a few minutes, but go ahead, Mark.
Well, our position is what you're saying. Relief from those rules that keep it very difficult for tax-exempt status is something we have to work on. That's a regulatory relief and potentially legislative relief that needs to be worked on. We've been working on that for some time. Our CFO is heavily engaged in that conversation. And I know the water utilities in the room have a lot to say about it as well.
It's been done in the transportation space.
Yeah.
And just as we had TIFIA,
Yeah,
which
TIFIA.
is transportation loans, federal loans for transportation, now there's WIFIA, so there's
Yeah.
another source of debt financing,
Sure.
if you will, which could be attractive if that ever gets launched. But they also have an opportunity to learn from the water side and have more a marriage of private activity and public tax exempt bonds. We can definitely increase our leverage and scalability. Katie, what's your biggest challenge between now and November if we're going to see this measure on the ballot?
Helping people understand what stormwater is and why it's important. We tried to do something similar to this, but not the same a few years ago, and a lot of people showed up and said, "How dare you tax the rain?" And I think what we need to do is embrace that and say, we need to tax the rain, because if we don't, it just pollutes our waterways and makes people sick, and we lose out on a great opportunity. And so changing how people think about it, turn it into a resource instead of a potential liability. I think that's our biggest challenge.
I don't know how many of you look at the street and the sidewalks when you're walking, if you walk in LA, which I do, and I'm always looking so I don't trip. There are those stamps that Heal the Bay put on by the storm drains, don't throw stuff in here. And you go, well, who's going to throw something in a sewer drain?
You'd be
Go to
surprised.
Hyperion. Go to Hyperion and see what comes through there, which I did when I was a Public Works Commissioner, and it was pretty astonishing. So there's one water, as Andy Lipkis, who's sitting here, likes to say, and it does come from the sky, but it goes into our lawns and our sidewalks and our streets and into the storm drains and out to culverts in the LA River out to the sea. So we have to manage it. Jeff?
Yeah, again, I think a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And we should be focusing on the climate change aspect in order to get the public to think about this differently instead of a rain tax. So when you say we're already going to be spending $100 billion on stormwater, but now we've got some new challenges with stormwater because water comes down quickly and we've got floods. We're not able to capture it and people's lives are at risk. We're going to spend $73 million on, I think LA County spent $73 million on flood mitigation just in the last rainy season. We know it's going to get worse and worse. Wildfires that used to burn 5 days on average are burning 52 days on average. There'll be more mudslides. There'll be more risk to human life. So being able to capture stormwater and be able to channel it properly and use it properly, when you also talk about the impact on the reservoirs of all this debris coming in, that's another expense which is being created by climate change. And so it's not politicians who are looking for more money. It's climate change has changed the game so that the infrastructure that we had in place and the governance structure we had in place is no longer adequate to deal with these issues. And we're either going to continue to spend money on cleaning out reservoirs and saving people from mudslides and dealing with the consequences of floods and still spending $100 billion on a system that is set for a prior time, not for the current time, or we can take that money and apply it in a thoughtful way to address the environment that we now have, the climate that we now have. And I think that's a story that has the benefit of being true, but that I think the public would understand.
Thanks, Jeff. I saw one other question here. Yes.
Quick one. So I appreciate and respect the fact that it obviously takes a cultural shift to be able to collectively see this as a problem, and education across all bodies, not just from kids in school and Angelinos, visitors alike. My concern is that the city of Cape Town, South Africa, is less than 90 days away from being the first major city to literally run out of water. So incentivizing is great. I think that's a great idea, but is it enough?
The-
Not be
Yeah.
Could you all hear the question? she was commenting on the city of Cape Town is within a very short period of time about to run out of water, and the question is voluntary incentivizing enough to bring the cooperation that's necessary to get things done? We go back to Jeff's "don't waste a crisis." Yeah. Do we have enough of a crisis in California to motivate people, Mark, to work together? And my question is, can the bureaucracies and the silos of government work together? You have a nice holistic agency, you're lucky.
Yeah,
but,
we are lucky.
But you have to deal with other government entities.
Well, yeah, and first of all, it hasn't been enough of a crisis, but for the Cape Town, we do not want the Cape Town situation to happen here, and I don't believe it'll happen tomorrow. But if we go on the path that we're on, there will come a day potentially where we have that kind of crisis. And in fact, we have experienced it in a much micro scale during the last drought. And the drought that continues to persist for LA County, many people are not aware of, is we do consider ourselves still in a drought condition in Los Angeles County. If you look at the maps for that, we have groundwater basins that have not been returned to what we would consider a normal yield. And so, and in fact, there were cities and communities in the state of California not so long ago and still to today that are actually hauling water to their place, their residents, and some who are completely out or businesses who have gone out. So we do have the Cape Town scenario in some isolated places, and in fact, it wasn't known. It wasn't advertised enough that had happened. You look what's going on in the Central Basin or Central Valley with respect to the drilling there, the subsidence that's occurring. We've had the same situation in the Antelope Valley. And the reason that the LA County took on and prevailed ultimately in an adjudication of the Antelope Valley was we had great evidence of unsustainable yield within the Antelope Valley. So those conditions do exist already. Education seems to be the issue, but it isn't usually till it hits our pockets, unfortunately, and that the water doesn't come out of the tap any longer that people start to really act. And the problem with that is that will be too late. That will be too late. So again, we as water individuals, as water industry, and this is where business can come to help to play here, as well as all the others in the room, is making people aware of how important, how precious this natural resources and how much of it we're wasting on an annual basis off to the ocean. That's a crime. And the fact that motivating industry is not always easy because you just want to get on with your business, especially if you're not in the water business. So again, educating. So the good news is the county is also in a leadership role in terms of that education piece, working with the water retailers throughout the area, with cities and others. We're actually kicking off a campaign called H2O for LA in Los Angeles. H2O for LA seeks to tell the water story without anybody's name on it, if you will, to better understand where our water comes from. I think everybody in the room feels my pain when I go, and we're just not the sexiest thing to talk about. You know, I was with the Dodger Foundation a couple of nights ago and talking to some of the players and the managers and that, and just industry leaders with their sponsors. And I asked the question about if they knew where their water came from. Even at Dodger Stadium, they didn't know they knew that Water and Power was a retailer, but they weren't necessarily aware of the cost and the size of the parking lots, for instance, around Dodger Stadium, how much runoff comes off of there and runs off to the ocean. So while I think government's been doing a good job, it is ultimately going to be the collective will of the community of Los Angeles to make a difference. And whether it's paying some tax or changing, again, the way we behave at our homes and our businesses. And I just have to give a little shout out, Kathleen, you mentioned Hilda Bay, but in fact it was the city of Los Angeles that stamped those stamps on the grates of Los Angeles' storm drain system. Adele's over there nodding his head. Okay.
I was there. It was a public-private partnership.
I was going to say, through a public-private partnership through
right.
Hilda Bay and the County of Los Angeles.
We will solve this problem.
Over 127,000 of those stamps are on the basins today.
Well, this is a topic that obviously is of interest to people at this conference. We really want to give a big round of applause and thanks to the panel. For those of you who are water junkies, stick around.